But I want to start with a joke, and if you're from Cuba or Venezuela, no fair, don't answer. What did the communists use for lighting before candles?
Fire.
Again, if you're from Cuba or Venezuela, don't answer. Well, they used electricity and light bulbs, of course, right? Like the good old days. Takes a minute to get it. But actually, that's the direction we're going in, folks. And it's because of the government's indoctrination system that we are moving towards socialism. They have turned generations of our people against our freedom, against our system of government, and toward the system of government that literally can't even keep the lights on in the capital city of Caracas, even though they have the largest oil reserves in the world. So I'm going to show you how they've been doing it. I'm going to give you a very abbreviated version of my education talk. If you want the longer one, the more detailed one, you can find it online. There's even a few copies in the back. I want to start with Shirley McCoon. Shirley McCoon, very weird lady, this lady here. She was hired by the U.S. Department of Education back in the late 80s to start working on national standards for the United States. Of course, the Constitution provides for no federal involvement in education at all. But during the Bush administration, they kind of came out of the closet, out in the open. They said, we're going to have a national system of education. So they hired this lady, Shirley McCoon, and you see her here. She's speaking at a conference of governors. All 50 state governors are in the audience. This conference was convened by George H.W. Bush. We met him a couple days ago. I showed you the clip of him talking about his little New World Order and all the rest of it. Listen to what she says they want to do with the schools.
Okay, to fix up these schools and take care of them. Rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America today and what is happening in Kansas and the Great Plains is not simply a chance situation in the usual winds of change. What it amounts to is a total transformation of our society. We have moved into a new era.
A total transformation of our society. That's what they're about. See, they don't tell the parents that their kids are going to school to help bring about a total transformation of our society, a total restructuring, she called it. Listen to how they're going to do this. She's very open about the fact that they're going to use the government's indoctrination system to do this. Listen.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical, and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is.
They use a crystal ball for that, right?
And figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization or the social change function of school.
See, how many parents do you suppose know that there's a social change function of schools? See, parents think they're sending their children to school to learn how to read and write and do math, maybe learn a little history and science. But the people running the system are telling you there's a social change function of schools. They're doing anticipatory socialization. They're going to figure out what we need in 50 years, and they're going to prepare the children for that. Do you suppose they actually know what's coming in 50 years? Are they psychics? They ought to play the lottery then, right? Why don't we read about them winning the lottery, okay? And as you dig deeper into this, you realize there's some really weird stuff going on. This lady that I just showed you, Shirley McCoon, she's also the co-author of this book here, The Light Shall Set You Free. And by the light, she's not talking about the light of Christ. If you read the book, you find out she's in communication, or claims to be, with ascended masters, these spiritual entities that are revealing secret knowledge to her. And she says in the book that all of us are going to have to know this secret knowledge if we want admittance into the fifth dimension, okay? Everybody else is going to be left behind. That'll be fun. Now, they have a plan. They've had a plan for a long time, and they brag about it. It's enshrined in their international documents. You've learned from Debbie, if you've been here for several years, about Agenda 21. This is an actual UN agreement signed by every government on the planet, including George H.W. Bush, Mr. New World Order that we met a few days ago. He was in 1992 down in Rio de Janeiro at the first UN Conference on Sustainable Development. That's where they came up with this agreement. You can pull it up on the UN's website and read it for yourself. Chapter 36 reveals the game plan. You guys remember Obama called us bitter clingers? He said these bitter clingers are clinging to their guns and their Bibles, right? How dare they? Well, they know that older generations of Americans are bitter clingers, and they know they're not going to transform us. Even all the fake news from CNN in the world is not going to get us to surrender our guns and our Bibles. So what do? They target the children. As you read in chapter 36, these are direct quotes, they say education is critical for sustainable development. They say it's indispensable. In other words, you can't do this without it. to changing people's attitudes. See, how many parents do you suppose know they're sending their kids to school to have their attitudes changed? Do you think parents would be okay with that? They say in the agreement, it's critical, this education, to giving children the right values, attitudes, skills, behaviors consistent with sustainable development. Do you think those values and attitudes are going to be consistent with yours? Well, as we go through here, you'll see that they will not be. They also say this needs to include spiritual development. What about the separation of church and state? Oh, no, we left that in the past. Now the UN is going to focus on the spiritual development of our children. They say it needs to be integrated into all disciplines. And I want to give you a sneak preview of what this looks like. We'll come back to the UN's spiritual agenda. But how do they do this transforming? How do they give kids new attitudes and new values? Well, they've been practicing this for a very long time. They've got 100 years of research under their belts. They know exactly how to do this. Some of you might be in public school, and you might recognize some of these tactics and techniques being used. So back when I was a kid, when I was in school, in first, second, third grade, this came out. This was in the early 1990s. Now, sodomy, homosexuality, was a crime in most of America. If you had told people that we were going to be having homosexual marriages, they would have laughed at you. They would have called you a kook, and in fact, they did. The John Birch Society warned about it, and people said, oh, that's so extreme. The head of the John Birch Society, Congressman Larry McDonald, introduced legislation in Congress to try to prevent this, and they laughed at him. They said, that's so silly. We're never going to have any homosexual marriages in America. Well, they were preparing the children far in advance. So in the early 1990s, they produced this documentary. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. And I want to show you a little clip from the documentary. This is what they showed little children, first grade, second grade, third grade, all across America in government indoctrination centers that like to identify as schools. Check it out.
Let me tell you quickly the background. Today, the law says that if you're same sex, 2 men and 2 women, you can't get married. It is against the law. And I thought that it might be kind of fun for us to sort of be pretend judges.
Pretend judges?
Give me to the sheet that just tells you that some people think that it's wrong for gays to get married, that it's not natural, that it goes against what a family is. Other people think that the state should not decide these things, that it should just be up to 2 adults to decide what they want to do. What do you think the answer to these questions are? Should gays be allowed to marry? Should they not?
Yep. And then 5 minutes of peer pressure. Yeah, how mean that we don't let loving gay people get married. Right? And then 30 years later, kabloom, the pretend judges on our Supreme Court strike down all of our marriage laws. I mean, they literally couldn't get this passed in California, the land of fruits and nuts. They asked the voters, hey, how about homosexual marriages? They said, no, we're good with God's definition of marriage. Thank you very much. In California, right? But they had prepared the children in advance so that the pretend judges on our Supreme Court could strike down marriage. And notice how they frame the argument, right? The one side, oh, they just don't want to let loving people get married. Those are the bigots, the horrible people. Is that the argument for marriage? We just want to... No, of course not, right? If they had given the true argument, what does the Bible say about marriage? It's a representation of the relationship between Christ and His church. It's a sacred institution. What do they tell our kids? Oh, it's just those mean old bigots. They just don't like gay people. It's absolutely preposterous. And so when you frame it in those terms, of course, these poor little kids that never had a proper education say, yeah, we should totally have the pretend judges strike this down. Right? That's what they did. And they've done this on issue after issue after issue after issue to the point where now the biblical foundations of our country have crumbled in the minds of our people. So what does the transformation look like? Well, it's getting crazier and crazier. I mean, some of the stuff you can't even imagine. In the state of Minnesota, a little boy decided that he was actually a little girl, with transgender stuff. And Mom, Dad, can I have a sex change? No, son, get on the bus, please. That's ridiculous. Well, the government school knew better than those old-fashioned bigoted parents. So they took this child to a medical facility, and I use that term loosely, and literally mutilated him surgically to try to make him into a fake woman, okay? Against the wishes of his parents. Yep. And in California, I pulled this right off the Department of Education's website. It's a gender transition plan. So if you feel like you might have been born in the wrong body, you fill out this form and the school will help you get hormone treatments, puberty blockers, preparation for surgery. And I don't want to get too graphic. And I was giving a talk on this in Florida, one of the most rural conservative counties, Flagler County in Florida. We had a few members of the school board in the audience, and they came up to me afterwards, like, Alex, that's in Flagler County too. The same exact form in one of the most rural conservative counties in a very conservative state. They're doing this everywhere. And as you read the forums, say, oh, do your parents approve of this? And if they don't, oh, don't worry. We'll call you by your real name when your parents are around. We won't tell them, but we'll get you ready so that by the time comes, you can go and have your surgery or whatever. And guess what? This is working, folks. It's working really well. When I was a kid, and it wasn't all that long ago, I'm like 34, I think. I lived in 8 countries, 4 different continents. I grew up with every kind of kid you could possibly imagine. Hindus, Buddhists, Shintos, Jews, everything, every different color. Never in my whole entire life did I meet a boy who didn't understand that he was a boy. Never. It didn't ever happen. Never did I meet a girl who thought she was something other than a girl. Now, in the state of California, this is UCLA data. This was released in 2017. 27% of the children ages 12 through 17 are gender non-conforming. So they're boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. Okay? That's the UCLA's data. And some of you are thinking, well, I live in a conservative state. That's not going to affect me. Oh, yes, it will. Okay. I was in Utah giving a talk similar to this in March of 2020, right before the coronavirus took away all our freedoms. And, well, I guess the coronavirus didn't do anything, did it? But this is in Utah, and I had an opportunity to meet with some of their state school board members, some of their top education officials, and they gave me this data. They pulled this out of the state controlled substance database, the database that tracks prescriptions. What they found was that in 5 years, in a 5-year period from 2015 to 2020, there had been a 10,000% increase in the number of children undergoing what they call medical transitions. They're pumping them full of hormones, right? The girls are getting testosterone, boys are getting estrogen, they're getting them ready to chop off body parts, okay? That's how crazy this has become, and this is Utah, one of the most conservative Republican states in America. If it's happening in Utah, it's happening in your state too. It gets even crazier. This is from California, and I feel guilty even showing this to you guys, but you need to see it, because this is what they're preparing people for. Just like they prepared people for this fraudulent version of marriage, they're preparing people for something even more wicked. So they passed an LGBT mandate in 2016 that all the kids had to learn the wonders of homosexuality and transgenderism and the history behind this. And I got a copy of the curriculum they were using in the Brea Olinda district. It starts off introducing Harvey Milk, a pervert pedophile who raped children, some of whom went on to go kill themselves. And then gradually they get down to ancient Greece, and they just casually throw out there that, oh yeah, Greek men used to have relations with little boys. And so this mom goes to the superintendent, the assistant superintendent of curriculum, and says, what in the world is wrong with you? How dare you teach that to my children? Listen to what she responds. Come on, it's just a different sexual orientation that's occurred in history. Oh, you couldn't hear? Okay. Well, so the mom says, why are you teaching my kids about pedophilia? What in the world is wrong with you? And she said, oh, well, it's just a different sexual orientation that's occurred in history. I mean, it's really important that we teach this to kids. Okay, and so think about, project the lines here. In the state of California, when this video was taken a couple years ago, it was already illegal to discriminate against someone based on their so-called sexual orientation. Now, we know that it would be totally insane to put a child rapist, a pervert, a pedophile in charge of the Sunday school ministry or in charge of the kindergarten. But what happens when these kids get older? They were taught in school that it's just a different sexual orientation. How dare you discriminate against those poor pedophiles, right? That's where this is going, folks, and they're training the next generation of children to believe this. Here's a classroom in California. You can see across the top, pedophilia is sexual orientation. That's the direction they're going, folks, and you're going to see in the years ahead, it's going to get more and more sick. Now, this indoctrination is working very effectively. They have radically transformed the attitudes of our people. If you look here on this poll, 36% of millennials are now pro-communist, and I'm a millennial. That's incredibly insane. Then 70% are pro-socialist. What did I say? We're moving toward Venezuela. We're moving towards Cuba, and they're doing it without even having to use violence. They're doing it by brainwashing our children in the government schools. Now, I want to show you the false religions they're teaching our children, because that really is one of the key objectives, is to turn our children away from Christ, turn them away from the Bible, and turn them toward any false religion. You know, Satan doesn't care what you're worshiping as long as it's not God. You can worship a rock, you can worship a statue, you can worship yourself, you can worship money. As long as it's not God, as long as it's not our Lord Jesus Christ, you're fine. Worship whatever you want, right? So John Dewey was one of the founding fathers of our government indoctrination system. And he was also a very religious man. Very, very dangerous guy. And he was one of the authors of the Humanist Manifesto. Okay, this is a religious document. And the very first tenet to this document is that religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. That's interesting. What does the Bible say? In the beginning, God created. Obviously, these two views are not compatible. Obviously, John Dewey knew what he was doing when they wrote out that there is no creation, right? It has always existed. And so even if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, I think you should be, this has really important implications as well. What does our Declaration of Independence say? It's a self-evident truth that God created us. He created us equally and He gave us rights. But what happens if you believe John Dewey's false religion? You can't have any God-given rights. Don't be ridiculous. The universe is self-existing and not created. Okay? So your rights, your freedoms are gone, and you believe a satanic false religion. As crazy as it sounds, the U.S. Supreme Court established this as our national religion in 1962. 1962, they said, nope, can't have prayer anymore in school. You can't pray to God. You cannot do that anymore. They said the First Amendment required it. In 1963, no more Bible in school, right? Can't read Bibles in school. And they said, oh yeah, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, means that the state of New York or your local school district cannot have prayer, cannot have Bible reading. Do you think that's what the founders meant with the First Amendment? Don't be ridiculous, right? I mean, come on. Most of the states had established churches at that time, right? It's absolutely inconceivable that the founders meant to ban prayer and Bible in school. If you had told the founders that you could have education without the Bible, they would have laughed at you. That's the dumbest thing ever. How could you possibly have education without the foundation of truth? It's ludicrous, okay? At least one justice noticed what was happening here. Justice Potter Stewart, he wrote the dissent. He said that the refusal to permit these religious exercises is thus seen not as the realization of a state of neutrality with respect to religion, but rather the establishment of a religion of secularism or humanism, as Dewey would have called it. So what Congress was not allowed to do, establish a national religion, the Supreme Court did under the guise of enforcing Congress not being allowed to set up an... That's how dumbed down our population was by the 1960s, that these maniacs in black robes could get away with something so ridiculous. Anybody with a basic understanding of American history or constitutional law would have laughed in the face of these people, and yet that's what they did. Okay? And I submit to you that we really went wrong in the 1850s when we started allowing government to run schools in the first place. That was our mistake. We'll come back to that. So, we can't have Christianity in the schools anymore. Can't have Bible in the schools, but we can have everything else. Okay, here is some kids on a field trip to a mosque, they're bowing down to Allah. This is happening everywhere. West Virginia, Tennessee, they've got the kids writing out the Islamic Shahada under the guise of doing calligraphy. This is the Islamic conversion prayer. And by the way, Muslims consider that once you've recited that prayer, you are a Muslim, whether you believed it or not. So they say Muhammad is the only messenger and Allah is the only true deity, right? Now, if you've read your Quran, you know Allah describes himself as the greatest of deceivers. I know somebody else who is the greatest of deceivers. So anyway, here is a school board in Kansas, the 5 pillars of Islam, right? You can have the 5 pillars of Islam, but don't you dare put up the 10 commandments. Okay, they got Buddhism in the classroom, they mindfulness exercises, right? I mean, it's everywhere, all over America. They're bragging about it. You get to do Hinduism in the classroom, they do yoga exercises. They also, and this has come out in the newspaper, they burn incense, and they put a little picture of a Hindu god, and they throw some orange peels up there and chant weird things. It's true. It's true. It's in government schools all over America. Now the Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter. We got to have that in every school in America. Well, I'm going to show you a teacher training program that they had at Howard University. They flew in teachers from around America to teach them how to teach Black Lives Matter. And as you'll see, they're doing a seance, right? They're teaching teachers to teach children to do a seance in the classroom.
And I'm going to ask you to hold an ancestor in your head right now. Ancestors watching, I know. They're watching. Ancestors watching, I know. Now call out your ancestors into the room.
Call out your ancestors into the room.
It only took us 5 minutes.
Okay, so what does God say about calling your ancestors? This is a seance, right? This is trying to summon the dead. What does God say about this? Does anybody know? It's an abomination. Thank you, Reverend. And yet we can do that in the government school classroom, but don't you dare recite the Lord's Prayer. Don't you dare read a verse out of the Bible. Don't you dare teach the kids that they shall not murder, that they shall not steal, that they shall not lie. That would be not separation of church and state. That's how ridiculous this has become, folks. They're teaching our children every false religion under the sun. And I forgot to say one thing about John Dewey's humanist false religion. Where have we heard this lie before, that man can be his own little God, that man can decide for himself? Thank you, Rev. See, Rev already knows. He has studied the scriptures. We've heard this, right? Go back to Genesis 3:5. Who told Eve, God just doesn't want you to be like God, right? He knows that if you eat that, then you'll be like God. Then you'll be able to. It's exactly the same lie that the humanists believe. Right? We don't need God to tell us what's right and wrong. We can decide that for ourselves. We can be our own little gods, right? These are all false satanic religions, and they're being taught to our children as truth. Okay? Now it's gotten to the point where they're just out in the open. Okay? State of California, a couple months ago, State Board of Education approved unanimously a new ethnic studies model curriculum. You should read it. The children will chant to the pagan, demonic Aztec deities of cannibalism and human sacrifice and war. They will ask these deities for help achieving critical consciousness and liberation. One of the maniacs who wrote this abomination, he goes by the name of Cuauhtemoc, wrote a book where he asked these pagan deities for help waging a counter-genocide against Christians in the Americas. Okay? And this will now be taught in elementary schools all over the state of California starting this year. Okay? We're just full circle now, right? Just Old Testament stuff. A people that wants new God is now going whoring after other gods and burning incense to false pagan deities, sacrificing children, right? 60 million abortions, exactly the same kind of stuff we saw in the Old Testament. Anybody know what happens next when God's people turn away from God and then they start worshiping demons? Horrible, horrible things, okay? You can expect that soon in a town and theater near you. Okay, and so what is the effect of this, right? America went from being a nation where almost 99% of people would have described themselves as Christians, where virtually everybody saw the world through a biblical lens, held a biblical world. Even the non-Christians saw the world through a biblical lens, to a world now where less than half of my generation, millennials, even describe themselves as Christians. And if you drill down further, and George Barna and other organizations have done this, even among the ones who describe themselves as Christians, less than 10% have a biblical worldview. How did this happen? 100 years of government indoctrination masquerading as education. Okay, that's what happened. Now they're moving toward a one world system. They want all the children of the world brought up into this satanic filth. And I'll show you. This is the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2015 talking about what education should do.
Education must more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count.
Yeah, we don't worry about
It
that.
must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
Global citizens. How many parents send their kids to school so they can become good global citizens? None? Okay. I'm not surprised. So now the UNESCO, the UN, they have a World Core curriculum. You guys have heard of Common Core, right? Well, they have a World Core curriculum at the UN, written by this maniac here, Robert Mueller. You should read his books. He's an absolute lunatic. He says the UN is actually the body of Christ. We totally misunderstood it. Rev is laughing. And he wrote this one World Core curriculum, and he says it should be taught in all the schools in the world. He actually wrote a foreword, and it's incredible how open they are about what they're doing. So in the teacher's manual for this World Core curriculum, he wrote a foreword, and in his own hand he says that the underlying philosophy upon which it's based be found in the teachings of Alice Bailey and the Tibetan teacher Javal Kuhl. And almost nobody in America today knows who Alice Bailey was, much less Javal Kuhl, but I'll give you a hint. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Yeah, surprise, right? Now they call it the Lucius Trust because Lucifer Publishing was just a little too obvious. And then this Tibetan teacher, Javal Kuhl. He's not Tibetan, he's not a teacher, and he's not even actually a human being. He is an ascended master. Okay, Alice Bailey claimed to be in communication with the same ascended masters that Shirley MacCoon, who we met at the beginning, was talking to. They give her these special revelations about where this is all going. And if the World Core curriculum is based on the ramblings of this lunatic and her ascended masters, we ought to know what they're saying. What are they saying? Glad you asked. She wrote a book, called Education in the New Age, Alice Bailey and her Ascended Masters. And in there, she says that world citizenship should be the goal of the enlightened, with a world federation and a world brain. Our problem is to attain the kind of overall synthesis that Marxism and Neo-Scholasticism provide for their followers, but we've got to get this using the freely chosen cooperative methods of John Dewey. So now we're back full circle to the humanist Marxist John Dewey. And for some perspective, John Dewey, who's widely regarded as the founding father of America's government education system, he looked to the Soviet Union for inspiration. So they want a one-world government based on a one-world education system that will fuse Marxism and Neo-Scholasticism using the methods of John Dewey, the humanist Marxist, determined to use the school system to transform our children into little collectivist, communist, human-worshipping pagans. Isn't that cute? Now we get to the Common Core. You guys have heard of the Common Core? Bill Gates put $2.3 billion of his own money into Common Core. And what less people know is that in 2004, he went over to UNESCO, the UN's education agency, and he signed an agreement with them. 2004, I've got a copy of the agreement. Phyllis Schlafly released it. And Bill Gates himself signed, along with the head of UNESCO. And they agreed they're going to create a global set of standards, a global curricula, global teacher training programs, and global technological systems so that all the little slaves of the world could learn the same garbage. Okay? And now I want to show you a little video, because they brag about what they're doing with Common Core. You don't have to believe Alex Newman. You can listen to them. This is the Common Core people with a commercial that they produced about how great Common Core is going to be.
It's been pretty hard to how well kids are competing in school and how well they're going to do when they get out of school. Is a girl in your neighborhood being taught as much as her friend over in the next one? Is a graduating senior in, say, St. Louis and prepared to get a job as a graduate in Shanghai?
Shanghai?
It turns out the answer to both of these questions is no. Because for years, states have been setting different standards for what students should know and be able to do at each grade level. What we really need are clear goals. That's where the Common Core state standards come in. The standards are consistent from school to school, and they match up against international standards too.
They match up against international standards too.
So even though local communities will still design their own curriculum with the same rules, everybody can compete on the same kind of staircase.
All right, so the kids in Chicago and Paris will learn the same thing as the kids in Shanghai and Detroit. Do kids in America, a self-governing free republic based on biblical principles, need to learn the same things as children living under the most murderous communist dictatorship that has ever existed in human history? Well, I don't know. They think they do. Right? Okay. And now finally, the one everything. Well, who's going to teach the kids how to read, write, and do math? Well, it's not the government schools. Okay. And you don't have to believe Alex again. Here we go. This is the government's own data. Every 2 years, the Federal Department of Education comes out with what they call it the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. It is the nation's report card. They take a representative sample of students from across America. They give them standardized academic tests. These are their results. Less than 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in math. Less than 1/3 of 8th graders are proficient in English. Less than 1/4 of high school seniors are proficient in math, and just 1/3 of seniors are proficient in reading. Here is the Deputy Secretary of Education admitting this in public right here in New Hampshire.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called Americanists report card, reports that 2/3, get this, 2/3 of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
Not proficient in any core subject. Okay, imagine any other industry. Imagine like a plumber, and less than 1/3 of his customers actually got their pipes fixed. And then he had the nerve to say, just give me more money, right? That guy would be in jail so fast your head would spin. And that's exactly what the government schools are doing. They're telling us that we're going to teach your kids how to read, write, and do math. Oh, just kidding. Your kids don't know how to read, write, and do math. But give us more money, and then we'll solve it. So they don't know how to read. They don't know how to write. They don't know how to do math. They don't know any history. They don't know any science. But they can tell you all about the 57 different genders. They can tell you how the planet's going to die from global warming if you don't pay a tax on the gas that you exhale. They can tell you all kinds of nonsense, but they can't tell you about anything that matters. And the worst part is they can't even educate themselves because they have been deliberately taught the whole word method of reading, which turns them into handicapped illiterates for life. Okay? That's the situation we're in right now. That's the bad news. But there is good news. It doesn't have to be this way. We need to get the children out of the public schools as quickly as we possibly can. Okay, so we're now in a situation very similar to what the British Army and the British people found themselves in during World War II. The troops were trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, totally surrounded by Nazis. Okay, National Socialists, by the way. They don't teach that anymore, but it's a fact. It's the National Socialist Party. And so what did the British do? Well, they knew that if their army was destroyed, they would be destroyed. That would be the end. They would all be speaking German, at least those who survived. We're in that situation now. If our children are destroyed, we're all going to be speaking metaphorical German. Okay? But the British people got on their knees and they prayed and they asked God for a miracle, and then they got to work. And everything that could float, every fishing boat, every pleasure yacht, every Navy ship, every commercial vessel went across the English Channel. They loaded up as many of those boys as they could. They brought them back to the British Isles. And not only did they live to fight another day, they're not speaking German still to this day on the British Isles. That's the attitude that we need to be taking now. Okay. There's churches all across this country that for 5 or 6 days a week are completely empty. They're growing cobwebs. Meanwhile, the children from that church are off at a government brainwash center learning how to chant to pagan Aztec deities. They're learning about 57 different genders. They're learning that the planet's going to die from the gas that you exhale unless you pay a tax to the UN. Okay, we've got to deal with this, folks. So I compare it to a burning building. Okay, the building's on fire. Your children are inside. What do? Well, obviously we sign a petition. You guys don't want to sign a petition? Well, who's going to get the children? I mean, someone's got to. No, of course not. That's silliness, right? You run inside, and every parent knows this. The building's burning. You don't sign a petition. You run inside and you grab your children, even if it means risking your life. Of course, that's what you do. It's your children. Okay? And yeah, there's some sacrifice involved. You're going to live a lower standard of living. One of you is probably going to have to stay home. You're going to have to drive an older car. You're going to have to live in a smaller house. Are your children worth it? I hope so. Okay? And the reality is this is much worse than a burning building. Because a burning building, that'll hurt your children physically. And, that's bad. Nobody wants their children hurt physically. But what's going on in the public schools is infinitely worse. They're destroying your children mentally, physically, morally, spiritually. They're teaching them lies from the pit of hell. And you're still sending them. Why? Okay? Pastors need to warn their congregations about this. You need to preach from the whole counsel of God. Here's what God says about education. He says, Caesar, in Proverbs 22:6, should train up the children in the way that they should go. I see some people laughing, the ones who know their Bible. Of course not, right? That's simply craziness. Nowhere in the Bible is there any delegation of authority to Caesar, to the civil government, to educate children. That's a modern innovation. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. Caesar never should have been involved in education. That's where we went wrong. Okay? The Bible has different spheres of authority, as you learned from Pastor Whitney. There's family government, there's self-government, there's civil government, and there's church government. One place education really doesn't belong is with the civil government. Rather, Proverbs 22:6, parents should train up their children. Deuteronomy 11, and this says this multiple times in Scripture, you, talking to parents, should teach your children when you're walking, when you're sitting, when you're waking up, when you're lying down, when you're walking by the way. How much time does that leave for Caesar to brainwash them? No. 5 days a week, 7 hours a day for 14 years. No, just kidding, right? That's craziness. That's absolute crazy talk. You're supposed to be raising up your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord all day, every day, 7 days a week. Even on the Sabbath, you should teach them. Okay? Doesn't mean you have to homeschool on the Sabbath, but you can show them. You can model for them, right? So what does the Bible say about education? It should be totally secular. Education should be separate from God. No, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. How much fear of the Lord are they teaching in public school? None. Okay, so how much wisdom and knowledge are your children getting? None, right? They're getting counterfeit knowledge. They're getting counterfeit wisdom that will lead to destruction. What happens when you don't have any knowledge? Well, we know, Hosea 4:6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, right? That's where we're headed, folks. As long as 74% of our children are in these brainwash camps, and that's the number right now, that's where we're headed. Now, there are children who slip through the cracks, no doubt about it. I say it's like playing Russian roulette, but you've got 5 rounds in the chambers instead of 1. So, yeah, maybe 1 out of 6, probably less, will make it out. But the vast majority are going to come out harmed severely. We were blessed to be born in a self-governing republic. That means there's another purpose to education. We need to be able to govern ourselves. That means we need to know our history. We need to know the science and the art of government. We need to know our Constitution. We need to know all of these things that go into making self-governing citizens. So one of the things that we can do once we escape these brainwash camps, hop off the Titanic and get in the lifeboat, is homeschool. Really, really great news. The number of homeschool families in America doubled over the last year. Yeah, I know, amen, right? Went from about 6% of the population to about 12% of the population. I suspect those numbers will keep going higher. Homeschoolers are dominating in everything, in case you haven't noticed. Okay, they're in the 80th to 90th percentile on the government's own academic tests. They are absolutely running circles around the victims of government school. And this is true even if the parents don't even have a high school diploma. Right? All you parents who feel inadequate, you could be dumb as a rock and you'll do a better job. I mean, you could put your kids in a closet for 12 years and you'll do a better job than the government schools, okay? There's a lot of great private schools out there. There are. And there's a lot of terrible ones. There's some that are even more woke than the government schools. So be careful. Don't just hand your kids over to anybody. I work with the Freedom Project Academy. It's one option. It's an online K-12 school. We've got some resources in the back, these magazines. We've got a new updated second version of the Save Our Children. Hal has some in the back. Grab some of those. And I think they're like $1. I don't know. Where's Hal? Not here anymore. I think they're like $1. You can order them in bulk, hand them out to your pastor, your friends, your neighbors, whatever. We started a new ministry called Public School Exit. Phenomenal operation. And I don't just say that because I'm the executive director. You should go look at our advisory board. For example, the former head of the Arizona Public Schools, the superintendent of public instruction, is on our board. Okay, after 4 years of, people say, I'm going to run for school board and I'm going to fix it. And God bless you, Rev. I love you and I appreciate that so much. But this lady became the superintendent of public schools, the top of the food chain in the government school system. She was there for 4 years. She said it's futile. You can't do anything. The system is rotten to the core, so we've got to get the children out. So now she has come onto our board. You should see our board. It's an incredible group of people. We will help anybody, anywhere who needs help getting a Christian school, a homeschool co-op, whatever it is. We'll come give speeches. We'll put you with the experts that you need. And critical that we do this. I've only got a few minutes left, folks, so I'm going to skip most of the other solutions that I was going to give you. We'll save those for another day. Hopefully y'all will be back next year. But I do want to close with a few scriptures because really that is ultimately the end goal. That's the end solution. As I told you guys in my last talk, it's not a political problem that we're dealing with. It's not even an educational problem. It is a spiritual problem, exactly. And if we don't deal with it with that in mind, everything we do is going to be a failure. It's going to be futile. Right? Unless the Lord builds the house, we're building it in vain. Okay? So, we're going through a lot of slides here. See, thought I was going to have more time. But one of the things that we know, and some people get really worried when they see this stuff, like, oh my goodness, we're doomed. Well, the Lord didn't give you a spirit of fear. That didn't come from God. Okay? So if that's your reaction, know that that's not from God. That is something that you should not be feeling. So yeah, we should be concerned. Yes, we should have a burning desire to do something about this, but fear is the wrong attitude. So one of the things that we need to do, and this is what our founders did, they appealed to every human institution. They appealed to the king, they appealed to the parliament, they appealed to the king's judges, and everybody they could find. Please stop oppressing us. Please let us be in peace. Please don't try to take our guns. And what did they do? They kept going. So once they ran out of human institutions, what did they do? They said, okay, fine, shackle us, we'll be good slaves. No, right? That's one of the flags from the Revolutionary era. They appealed to heaven. They appealed to a much higher court, right? The Supreme Court acts like they're the law of the land. They're the final authority. Baloney! Okay, God's Supreme Court is infinitely higher than their fraudulent court. So we need to appeal to heaven. Really, God is the only one who can truly help us. Now, one of the things that I like to do, and if you feel called to this is a command. Notice it's not like if you feel like doing it, but in Ephesians 5:11, the Apostle Paul tells us to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Notice it's not some fellowship, a little bit of fellowship. Oh, I'll just have a tiny little bit of fellowship here. No fellowship. What should we be doing? We should be reproving them. We should be exposing them is the word that some of the translations use. So when you see evil, don't participate in it. Expose it. Reprove it. Call it out. Right? Yeah, as the Reverend said, everywhere Jesus went, he was offending people. Yes, it's offensive when you tell evil people that they're doing evil things to their face. No, murdering babies is evil. Yeah, that offends people who like to murder babies, but we need to say it anyway, okay? I mentioned I mentioned 2 Chronicles 7:14. I'll reiterate 4 things, okay? If we humble ourselves, if we pray, if we seek His face, and we turn from our wicked ways, God says He'll hear from heaven, forgive our sin, and heal our land. Okay, that's the things we need to do. And I also mentioned Ephesians 6:12, and we'll leave it here after we get to Ephesians 6:16 and 17. But again, this is the true nature of what we're dealing with now, folks. We're not wrestling against flesh and blood. It's not, a lot of people say George Soros. If we could just stop George Soros and the Democrats, America would be saved. No, okay? George Soros is not the top of the food chain, folks. Okay, the top of the food chain, I'll give you a sneak preview of, spoiler alert, Satan is the commander-in-chief, okay? And his minions. And that's what we're dealing with. Powers and rulers of the darkness of this world. Spiritual wickedness in high places. And if that's not clear from what we just saw about education, right? The Lucifer Publishing Company, where do these people come up with this garbage, right? It's because we're dealing with powers and principalities, okay? And so what does God tell us to do in light of this? Well, I'm glad you asked. Take the shield of faith. What's the shield of faith going to do? It's going to enable you to withstand all the fiery darts of the wicked. So when they tell you lies, homosexual marriage, you should murder babies, it's just a choice, right? Nope, shield of faith, thank you very much. Those fiery darts are quenched. And then we have an offensive weapon as well, right? The sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And they say, hey, homosexual marriage, you say, no. God created the male and female, and marriage is a union between one man and one woman. When they say you should kill babies, no, God said thou shalt not murder. Right? All of these issues of our time, we have answers to them, and our sword of the Spirit is our weapon to go forth into battle and slay these demons. And again, I'll close with some really, really good news. I read the end of the book. We win, they don't. God bless you guys. Thank you.